Hi kids, it's back again with another story from the Bible, and this is again last time we were talking about Jesus was a baby and how Joseph took Mary and Jesus and went off to Egypt and then eventually came back to Nazareth. And so now in this part we don't know a lot about Jesus when he was a little kid. The Bible tells us about when he was a baby. And it tells us this story about when he was a 12-year-old. And so I'm going to read a story here about Jesus when he was 12 years old. And now most of you probably aren't 12 yet, but you might have brothers or sisters or cousins that are 12. But you think about a 12-year-old, and they might seem kind of big to you, but they're still kind of a kid too. So this is about when Jesus was still a kid. And I'm going to read through the story, and then we're going to talk about a little bit about it. So every year, Jesus' parents went to Jerusalem for the Passover festival. Now that's the biggest celebration in the Jewish calendar, in the Jewish year. You know, we just got through Christmas. Christmas is a big celebration for us, isn't it? And you hear a lot about it, and the Passover for them was a big deal. And so they actually went to another town to celebrate. So they went to Jerusalem for the Passover festival. When Jesus was 12 years old, they attended the festival as usual. This is something they did every year. After the celebration was over, they started home to Nazareth. Remember, that's where Joseph brought his family after they were in Egypt. They came back to Nazareth. But Jesus stayed behind in Jerusalem. His parents didn't miss him at first because they assumed he was among the other travelers. But when he didn't show up that evening, they started looking for him among their relatives and friends. When they couldn't find him, they went back to Jerusalem to search for him there. 3 days later, they finally discovered him in the temple, sitting among the religious leaders, listening to them and asking questions. All who heard him were amazed at his understanding and his answers. So they went to the festival like they did every year. Jesus is 12, and when they started heading for home, they were walking, right? They didn't have cars, they didn't have bicycles, they didn't have trains, they walked. And so they had walked about 65 miles. Now, that's a kind of a long way. 65 miles. And so if you're going to walk that as a family, it would probably take you 4 or 5 days. So it's a long walk. And so they started back to Nazareth, and they just thought, well, Jesus was, he's 12, so he was pretty responsible. He knew that they were going to be leaving, and so they didn't worry about him. But when they got to where they were staying for the night, because they couldn't walk all the way home in one day, they got to where they were staying, and Jesus wasn't there. He wasn't there. And so then they started looking for him among their relatives and friends. So they had other people they had traveled with from Nazareth, and so they started asking around, Jesus with you? Is Jesus with you? But he wasn't. And so they turned around. It says, turned around to go back, and they walked all the way back to Jerusalem. And do you think that Mary and Joseph were a little worried? Have you ever been left behind, like at church or something, and your mom and dad maybe forgot to count kids in the car, and they went home, and then they realized they left you behind? I think we did that once when we had 5 kids in our family, and our youngest daughter, she remembers getting left at church, and maybe we thought she was going home with somebody else, but we forgot her, and so we had to come back and find her. And that's what happened to Jesus, and they left him behind. Now, they got back and they found him. It says 3 days later they found him, and he was in the temple. And in the temple is where the teachers would listen, sit, and these were men that would just, all they did all day was study the Bible. They studied and they discussed and they talked about the things they were reading. And that's what they did. They were in the temple, and that's where they found Jesus. And he had been there for several days talking to these men who studied the Bible. And he was asking them questions. And they were asking him questions because it says they were amazed at his understanding and his answers. And his parents didn't know what to think because they'd left and he'd stayed behind. Why did he do that? And Mary said, "Son, why have you done this to us? Your father and I have been frantic, searching for you everywhere." They were looking for Jesus because they were worried about him. He wasn't where they were supposed to be. Have you ever worried your mother? Done something? I'm going to ask you some things and you tell me whether this would worry your mom or not worry your mom. So, let's say you're at home, you're playing quietly in your room. Does that worry your mom? No. No. How about playing in the street, out in traffic? Would that worry your mom? Yes or no? I think for most of you, you said yes, that would worry your mom. How about building with Legos? Does that worry your mom? No. How about playing with knives? Yes, probably so. How about walking to the neighbors when your mom's watching out the door to make sure you get there safe? No, that wouldn't worry your mom, would it? How about not coming straight home when it's dark and you're coming from the neighbors to your house? Would that worry your mom? Probably so. And so Jesus worried his mom, and she didn't know why he'd done that. What did he do that for? He said, "Why? We've been looking all over. Why'd you do that?" And Jesus said, "But why did you need to search? Didn't you know that I must be in my Father's house?" But they didn't understand what he meant. See, Jesus was the Son of God. He was God's Son here on earth, and he was beginning to understand that as he had been growing up. And so he understood that he was learning, and he had some understanding about what these men in the temple were talking about. And so he stayed there because he knew that he was destined to live for God and to be God's Son. And he came to live and to die on our behalf. And he was beginning to understand that and beginning to interact with those that knew God's Word. So Mary and Joseph were pretty upset. And they were used to Jesus being no trouble at all, because Jesus never did anything wrong. But he needed to be about his Father's business, and his Father was God. And he was beginning to understand that. So what do we learn from this story? One thing we learn is that Jesus had some understanding at this point, that he had come right from God. He was God in the flesh, and he was beginning to understand that. He hadn't been to school like these leaders that he was talking to. He hadn't spent all his days studying the Bible. But he had some God-given understanding. And then it says that after this, it says he returned to Nazareth with them and was obedient to them. And his mother stored up all these things in her heart. And Jesus grew in wisdom and in stature. That means he got taller, and in favor with God and all the people. So we don't know too much about Jesus when he was growing up. But we know that when he was 12, he was beginning to understand his place and who he was. And that he had understanding, and he was sharing that. And he was going to be about his Father's business, God's business. He had a mission to accomplish. And so that's the story. That's one of the little bits of information we have about Jesus when he was a boy. when he was 12 years old. See you next time.